IVM.
Hi, everybody. On behalf of the team at IVM Podcast, I have a request for you. We'd really appreciate it if you could go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and fill out our survey over there. It's going to take a few minutes to do, but it gives us some really interesting information that we can take to advertisers and brands about who's listening to the network. If you're comfortable giving us your email address, while you're filling out the survey, we'll enter you into a random drawing where we'll be sending out a bunch of IVM swag to some of our listeners. Last year, we sent out coffee mugs, and this year we're hoping to send out much cooler stuff. That's ivmpodcast.com/survey. We really appreciate your help.
This is Storytellers and Storytellers live on tape. You're listening to Vineet Kanabar on the IVM Podcast Network. As we go closer to episode number 50 of this podcast, who would have thought it? 50 episodes, almost 50 episodes in. I want to continue to keep bringing you people who are working in different facets of the entertainment industry, whether it's digital or TV or music or poetry or podcasting. And I'm very fortunate today to be joined by someone who does all of those things. Say hello to Natasha Malpani-Oswal of Boundless. We'll talk more about Boundless. But hey, Natasha, great to have you here.
Hey, I'm so excited to be here, Vineet. I've followed this podcast since it started.
I'm aware. We've been about doing this for a while, and I'm so glad that we've managed to find the time and do it right. Without too much ado, let me get right into it, right? And like I mentioned in that very brief introduction, you're a poet, a podcaster, a producer. That's like one piece short of the four P's of entertainment, I guess. Tell us about how you do it. I mean, first of all, is there a scheduling hack that you know that we don't, that allows you to do so much? Take us through what it is that you're doing right now with all of these cool things.
So my day job is to be a producer. So I run Boundless Media, which is a creative house that makes experimental shows and films. So that's honestly how I spend most of my time. But I'm also a poet and podcast host, as you said, on the side. I mean, I sort of cheat and do both because my podcast is about my poetry. So it's not as impressive as it sounds. But the poetry, honestly, it started very much as a private thing. I used to just write notes to myself, my phone app. And I guess in a very millennial way, I started publishing these notes on Instagram. And they got such a great reception that I converted that poetry into my first book, Boundless, which Touchwood has done really, really well. And that book was then converted into my podcast, which is also called Boundless. And now my company is also called Boundless. So I guess there's a connection there. But, maybe you'd say I could be more creative, given I'm in a creative field with the naming.
Tell us about the thought behind Boundless. What's Boundless all about?
So initially, and now it's actually taken on different meanings. But initially, the message or the reason to call my poetry book Boundless was the message of the poetry book actually is that all of us are boundless. So I basically wrote these poems, it was like a personal diary. Wrote these poems to myself when I was coming back to India after 10 years. I transitioned from being an immunologist to an investor. I was moving back to India as a producer. And, even though I grew up in India, I didn't really feel like I was coming home because I'd changed so much in those 10 years. So I was honestly quite scared to come back. So I wrote those poems as sort of a record of, my journey of self-exploration or discovery over the decade. And then I think through writing those poems, I actually realized that it was super freeing just to put my feelings and fears into words. And I think that's honestly also why the poetry has done so well, because I think a lot of people resonate, with that vulnerability, because, all of us go through change, right? And we better embrace change. I guess 2020 has sort of shown us that, you don't jump in, you're not all in, you're going to be in trouble. So that was the story behind Boundless. It was basically my journey of discovering myself and then telling other readers that each one of you, can evolve, can find your voice. And the reason I call my creative house Boundless is because we are a boundless house in the sense that we experiment with formats, genres, stories. We're truly experimental in what we do. We make stuff for film festivals. We make stuff for YouTube. We make stuff for platforms. And we do short films, we do series. Hopefully at some point we might even do a feature film, who knows. We're obviously also exploring audio and publishing. So that's why the company is called Boundless.
Fantastic. I think it's a very unique and interesting spin on what you said, the boundlessness of human creativity and boundlessness of human spirit. Very interesting name. And I think if there is anything, and I'm going to say this in the nicest, meaning it in the nicest way possible, if there's anything we have learned from a certain Mr. Trump, it is that if you've got a good name, you stick with it, right? You make it. But that's probably the only good lesson out of Mr. Trump, right? Lot to unpack there from what you said, right? Your journey, studying abroad, immunology, podcast, poetry, book, and now a company. So let's go step by step. The first thing I want to ask you is, you do realize that if you were an immunologist, we would have a lot of use for you at this time.
Yeah.
A lot of use. But jokes apart, immunology, then investment banking, and then entertainment and creative expression and creative company. Help me make sense of this.
I can tell you a really nice story looking back. So I'm going to connect the dots for you. But obviously, when I was making these decisions, I didn't have that really beautiful story in my mind. So I honestly was taking a lot of risk and sort of at each point just jumping, I think, before I looked. But I'm so happy to have done that. So honestly, the reason I first studied immunology is just super boring. My parents were doctors. I did really well in school. And, when I was growing up, it was just assumed that, if you were a smart kid, you do medicine or engineering. And so in a very uncreative way, I didn't even bother to ask myself what I wanted to do. I was so focused on pleasing my teachers, my parents, the people around me, that I just, actually enrolled into medical school. So that's one more thing I did. I enrolled into medical school. Wow. And then I dropped out in the first week, because I was like, oh my God, I feel sick in a hospital. I hate the sight of blood. I myself don't want to take injections. There's no way I'm giving anyone an injection. Then was like, okay, obviously I should think through my choices a little more. But I still, wasn't bold enough to make a huge transition. So I went into immunology. So studied the immune system, like you said, which might have been helpful in COVID. And then worked briefly in cancer research. But again, when I was in cancer research, it sounds really sexy. Sounds like you're changing the world. It's so boring. Honestly, most of the time you're just in a lab, you're pipetting things, you're washing test tubes, you're just, repeating yourself. And I very quickly realized that actually I'm much too creative and much too extroverted, to be stuck in a lab. So then thought, okay, then I was like, and by this time I'd actually gone abroad. I'd gone to Oxford. And going abroad, leaving India sort of made me realize that the world is such a big place. You really can do what you want. And, what you study does not have to be linked whatsoever to your career, right? That's just a myth, I think, that people are told or were told 10 years ago in India. So I said, okay, it doesn't really matter what I've studied. What is it I actually want to do? And I said, I honestly, I want to make money, but I also want to help people. So how can I do both? And I found impact investing. So impact investing is basically investing in education and health, both for impact and return. And I just took a totally blind chance on a job I applied to. I found a job on Twitter where an impact investing fund was getting set up in London, and I applied, and they took a chance on me as well. Even though I had zero finance background and a lot of people who applied were a lot more qualified, I got the job, and I actually ended up staying 5 years helping build that fund in London. And that fund turned into $1 billion company. We went, from making zero, from having obviously no portfolio because it was a startup, to making 50 investments. And it was an amazing way just to, see how a company is built, but also how investment decisions get made. And also to really just see how businesses are built across sectors.
Right.
So that was super, super cool. Just really lucky to have, that chance. I think you can't plan for something like that. And then I decided to do an MBA because I thought that I was going to come back to India and set up an impact investing fund. So went to Stanford. And again, I think going to Stanford was a huge, huge turning point for me because, when you live in Silicon Valley, you're sort of living in the future. You're told every day and you see every day that anything is possible. The future doesn't just happen, you make it. So I was just surrounded by people who were so entrepreneurial, had so much energy, that I started thinking, what is it that I really want to do? Forget what I have a track record in, or, what I'm good at. Like, how do I want to spend the next 30 years? And they asked these two really interesting questions in the MBA. One was, what do you do in your free time? And two, what did you do as a kid? And I realized, the answer was so obvious to me. When I was a kid, I was such a nerdy kid. I wrote my first book, which was hilariously a biography at the age of 4.
Oh, wow.
I started my first startup. Yeah, come on, it was must have been 15 pages, But
yeah,
we bound it.
I'd be lucky if I had 15 words. Right? 15 pages. Humble brag. No, please go on, sorry.
That's my whole point, right? I always read and wrote a lot, and I just took it for granted because my whole family is so academic, I guess. And then I started my first startup at the age of 9, which was a library. And obviously, again, a terrible choice of startup, right? But we ended up making so much money that the school had to shut us down. Oh, wow. And and also then when I was an investor in London, I was a part-time journalist. Right. So I sort of realized that, hey, every time I actually have free time, or when I do when I'm doing what I want to do in a way that's not connected to my career, I'm actually reading and writing. So obviously I love storytelling. So why can't I be a storyteller? And, this was between 2016 to 2018. OTT platforms were just entering India. Geo had taken off. So you were seeing the digitization of the country. And obviously I was seeing it from a distance because first I was in London and then California. So I guess maybe that sort of helped me see it a bit more clearly. And so sort of sitting in, California, obviously Netflix was right there. Amazon's food was right there. You could do trips to LA and sort of see what Hollywood was thinking. And so I realized that, of course, if you're going to be in India and if I want to be a storyteller, digital entertainment seemed like the most no-brainer place to be because you had all these new global platforms coming in, exactly like your podcast, right? There were so many story sellers coming in, I guess, though I guess, maybe not story buyers. Story buyers coming in. But, where were really the storytellers? Because you had these very conventional production houses that made stuff for Bollywood. You had these very indie houses, that were making stuff for film festivals. And then you had TV houses that were making stuff for TV. But who was really making stuff, for the next generation of India that was coming online, Gen Z, millennials, who was making stuff for the platforms like Netflix, Amazon, for a changing audience. And I was like, this is such an exciting place to be. So again, took a totally blind chance and just applied to 2 companies, only 2 companies in India. Because I was like, I'm not going to move back unless I get a job at either one. Right. And they were the Viral Fever and Pocket Aces. Oh wow! I did not know
that you replied to the Viral Fever. That's interesting.
Yeah. I just applied to both. Right. And luckily, I got a role at both. And then decided to join Pocket Aces. And again, full credit to them because obviously I was totally new to the industry, but they gave me the role as head of Dice, which was a long form platform. So I basically got to come to India and then sort of learn production literally from scratch. So I built a creative team, did development, oversaw scripting, oversaw shoot, oversaw edit, worked with platforms. Made shows for YouTube. So basically just got to see basically every part of what it takes to make a web series at different scales with Pocket Aces.
And not a bad place to do it at all.
Yeah, no, it was amazing because Pocket Aces is exactly that sort of, very entrepreneurial company that really also saw this wave of digitization and changing audience behavior. So it was absolutely a perfect touch wood in terms of the role and the place to sort of, I guess, learn to be a producer.
Fantastic. I have massive respect for what Pocket Aces has been able to do with Dice and with the other brands as well, now Loco. Interesting fact there actually. My boss and TVF, my alma mater for a while, has a very strong Stanford connection as well. A bunch of people from
Karan Shah.
Karan and Dhaval both used to be there. Now obviously management has changed, and that's entirely different story. But very, very interesting encapsulation of sort of your 10-year journey in less than 10 minutes. I'm sure there's a lot there, right? Help me understand this, right? I mean, because immunology, investment banking, impact investing, and then you find yourself at top couple of production houses or digital storytelling companies, and you're learning on the job, right? What is that experience like? I mean, it definitely takes a lot of courage to step into something like that, but it also definitely, I'm sure, takes a massive open mind to learn and grow and work with people. So what was that like? Your early days at Dice, when you were starting out to build this whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I guess luckily I figured that out, I think at 18 or 19 that you better, when I made the mistake of, going to medical school and then doing immunology. So I guess I would say just make as many mistakes as you can early. But I sort of realized that it really doesn't matter what you studied. The only place that you can ever learn is a job. And honestly, I also sort of learned that, everyone, it doesn't matter how much experience they have, the world is changing so quickly. We're continuously all having to sort of reset. And in fact, if you are too much of an expert or you're too set in your ways, you're going to be left behind. So I actually think, coming to this industry, especially a creative industry, especially when, the market is changing, the audience is changing, people are getting a lot smarter, they're a lot more demanding. You can't just do the same thing. So actually, I think, and maybe I'm biased, but I think it's a disadvantage, to come from a very traditional background because you're not able to think from first principles. So, I mean, I guess I'd already been so used to sort of changing jobs, changing functions that I honestly, like the transition for me, it wasn't overwhelming at all. Like I didn't feel like, this is going to be scary. I was actually super excited because I felt like for the first time what I was doing would feel like a job. I mean, I'm sure you feel this, right? Like imagine like our job is to tell stories. That's so cool. Like I used to go to work and I used to be like, oh my God, like now I'm brainstorming about like, whether we should make a show on family or friends. Now I'm looking at a script, about two people dating. Now I'm on set, sort of deciding whether either like we need to change the lighting or whether like the performance, whether, I don't know, like whether we need to fire someone, whatever, it's not all fun. Whether we need to replace the team or like now I'm trying to convince a platform why they should buy our story. I mean, it's a really cool job. It's honestly, I think, a big privilege to be able to do what so many other people want to do.
Most definitely. Like I think even on my worst day at work, it feels like you're blessed to be doing this. Right?
Exactly.
It's whatever you can think up and you can bring to life here. That's the canvas you've got. So yeah, I mean, absolutely. The love of storytelling and having a diverse background, I think, definitely sounds like a great potent mix for you to get.
I also think, honestly, when it comes to a production job, like what does a producer do, right? Like a producer, you need to be a mix of someone who's creative and practical. So anyone who has experience, I think, of just building and managing teams and making sure that stuff gets done on time, on budget, can be a producer. I mean, you're also a producer, right? Like you're a podcast host, but you're producing the show.
Absolutely.
I
produce a bunch of things in my days. I am currently... I've been tasked with seeing how we can turn a traditional media agency into a producer. So exactly. It's a very fun remit, right? And anytime you're producing something, I think the intersection of creative, of fiscal, of practical, of it's just a whole lot, right? And there are no rules. There just aren't any rules. I mean, Ekta Kapoor might have her own rules, but then Anirudh Pandita has his own. So everybody's got their own, right? So it's a great gig to be at. Right? Let me ask you this, and I know I asked you a little bit about the name behind Boundless, but when did you start out? I mean, while you were at Dice, I'm guessing is when you turned your book into a podcast. Was that happening in parallel? Did Dice
So everything happened in parallel. So I basically, so when I was at Dice, I worked on 6 shows, got to released 4, including Little Things 3, which is a Netflix original, and at the same time released my poetry book. And then sort of converted the book into a podcast. And then I left Dice and then took a little bit of time, just to think, what do I actually want Boundless Media to be? in terms of a creative house. What are we going to do that's truly experimental, genre bending? How are we going to stand out? And so then started Boundless in January 2020. So we're totally a 2020 company. Oh, and so obviously, the pandemic obviously hit 2 months later. And it's actually, obviously like it's been super annoying to have to be online and do Zoom calls, etc., etc. But it's also been actually really exciting, in terms of building a creative house online, because one, it's obviously forced us to be creative. Every time you have any constraints, you just have to think outside the box. So we've actually made 3 series in lockdown, which I would have told you is not possible to do, right? Like whether it's brainstorming or scripting or shoot or edit, how are you going to do it from a distance? Entertainment industry is such a relationship-based industry and it requires so much in-person time. But I mean, we did all of that online, so it is possible. So that was, I think a good eye-opener in terms of just testing, like, how much do you actually need, to be in person to get things done. And then the second thing was the whole Boundless team has been built online. So I've just, obviously it's much better to meet people in person, to get to know them before you get them to join a startup.
How big is the team right now?
The team is, so we have 7 full-time people, but we work with a ton of freelancers. Right. So, in terms of each show, I think we've worked with between 30 and 40 people.
Right.
So there's the full-time team, and then obviously like everyone we've actually had to find in terms of writers, directors, editors, actors. It's all been done, from a distance.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Where do you stay?
Perry Road.
Oh, there's lots of birds around you.
Can you see the birds?
No, I can hear them.
Oh, you can hear them.
No, it's nice. Yeah. I mean, I love doing this sort of recording where there's like a bunch of ambient noise. It gives such a nice homely feel. Coming back to Boundless, right? So you're telling us about how your 2020 company, right? And starting a company in 2020 is already like playing the game on hard mode. And on top of that, it's not a manufacturing company, right? There's not a set process. It's not like, assembly line and molds and packaging and done, right? It's creative product. It's got emotions tied to it. It's got creativity. I can only imagine how hard it is to give feedback to a writer online, right? I mean, given that writers are already people with such sort of sensitive states of mind anyway. Tell us a little bit more about this transition from Dice to Boundless. And let me sort of qualify that question with a little bit of texture. What was it that you took from Dice as learning? Right? I'm guessing you spent about 2.5 years at Dice. Is that about right?
No, a little more than a year.
Oh, a little more than a year then. What were your great learnings out of Dice that you brought into Boundless, and what were sort of fresh thoughts that said, hey, this is Natasha Malpani-Oswal's company, and this is what it's going to be like. So tell us about a little bit more about the transition, what learnings you took from Dice, and what was new, and what is the new spin for Boundless for you?
Sure. So like I said, Dice was a very exciting place to be, because I think Pocket Aces is one of those companies that really early on saw how India was going to be transformed by both the internet and also this need to make more relatable content, right? Because Bollywood was basically either setting stories in London, and just making them about really privileged people who had private planes, or just making very high drama shows about families breaking up and coming back together, or twins who'd been separated. So it was very, it was entertaining, but we weren't really seeing ourselves reflected on screen. So I think what I really learned at Dice was how to, build characters and tell stories that are truly relatable. You see, whether it's little things, right? Dhruv Sehgal and Mithila Palkar, where you watch them on screen, and it's not just like chemistry, which obviously is stunning, I think. It's also just the sort of conversations they have, the problems they go through. I mean, in a way, you can say they're mundane, they're everyday problems. So to take an everyday problem, like deciding whether to do long distance or not, and then making that into an entire season, which is 4 to 6 hours of content for people to watch, is, a risk. But it's also, I think, has huge payoff because people, if they feel like they can connect to that character and story, will be much more emotionally invested, versus just being entertained and then sort of leaving the theater and forgetting about it. So I think that was a big lesson. How do you tell relatable stories that people can connect to? And I think the other really good lesson from Pocket Aces and Dice was, just to think as a startup, right? Because I think a lot of production houses and media houses don't necessarily, I think they take a lot of pride in thinking of themselves as creative and not really having normal working hours and proper structures. And there's honestly a lot of chaos, right? In the industry, not just in terms of how people work, but even in terms of how you decide who to work with, in terms of how you decide, in terms of basically how every decision from what story to tell to budget gets made. And I think one really great thing, I think both about Pocket Aces and TVF is that they wanted to professionalize the industry. They were like, it doesn't need to be black box and opaque. You don't need to be related to someone to come in. You don't need to have spent 10 years being an AD, right? As long as you have the talent, you have that voice, you have the ability to learn, of course you can break in, why not? And so I think those two things definitely I want to take to Boundless. I have taken to Boundless that, it's really important that people connect with the stories, that you make them feel something. And that even if they don't see themselves reflected in every story, our stories, I think we take our storytelling a notch higher impact, because we say that we won't tell a story that doesn't have an element of societal commentary. So that's already a point of differentiation. So we say we tell stories that are untold but unheard of, because our thesis is there's so much truth in fiction. There's so many conversations that you want to have, or things you want to say, or feelings you want to express in your everyday life to your partner, to your sibling, to your parent, to your colleague that you don't. And actually, fiction is the best place to actually find that. And so all our stories, so Unseen, that the lockdown series we made, was a dark take on mental health. We explored grief, privilege, anxiety. Our current series, Cancelled, is this tragicomic look at online bullying, the life of 3 Gen Zers who realize that
I saw the first couple of episodes. It's hilarious.
Thank you. And it's funny, right? It's entertaining, but there's actually huge social message there, because we explore mental health, we explore sexuality, we explore the dark side of social media, we explore cyberbullying, right?
Yes,
so that's
so. But the stereotyping and the conflict between Chinmay and the girl's character about stereotyping, that's also very, very interesting.
Exactly. So, we think very deeply. So we're not just in the business of entertainment. We actually want to reflect the world as it is, as it could be, help you think about yourself, about other people, the way you relate to them. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is definitely in terms of the professionalization. We say we're telling stories for a new India, right? So our audience is also Gen Z and millennial, but we think, it's not just that the audience is getting smarter and more demanding. It's also, I think the audience, they want fresh voices, they want fresh talent, and you have to now, I think, be much more professional, much more structured in the way you operate, So we're a very professionally run company. We put a lot of effort into finding our writers, our directors, our producers, our editors. We're always on the lookout. It's completely meritocratic. And actually, we say we look for people that are both creative and practical, because I think it's also a myth to say that if you're creative, you're just up in the air and, you can just sort of float away and then not be seen for 3 months. There's no reason that you can't be creative, but also actually, maintain a professional working standard. And so I think that's sort of that's we're a new age media company because of the type of stories we tell, because of the way we're run and who we work with, and also because everything we do is very experimental / genre bending, but also risky, because we say we're investing, in the quality of our stories. It takes more time, frankly. So it means we're putting out less things. So it's not like a spray and pray model. We invest more, but then, hopefully the payoff is also a lot higher. So fingers crossed.
Let me ask you this. Is there, usually when a creative entrepreneur starts out with a new company, there's a sort of North Star in terms of, hey, I want my company to be like this one, or learn from this company. Is there a benchmark that you have in mind? When I joined TVF, right, we used to have a saying which was, we want to have the creative depth of a Disney, but the growth speed of a Facebook. One of those, things that you tell a VC, but eventually they do become sort of guiding mantras for you as well in the company. Anything like that for you when you started Boundless, saying, hey, this is what success looks like. This is what I want my company to do.
Yeah, I actually love that. Like I love that mantra that you guys had. So I think, the two benchmarks for us, we'd say, three actually. So there's three benchmarks for us. One is A24. A24 is an indie film studio that has made extremely risky and experimental films, from Caves to Moonshine to, sorry?
Uncut Diamonds?
Yeah, exactly, to Uncut Diamonds, right? Where, basically it's a small creative house set up by two guys from New York. And everyone told them, firstly, like, what are you doing in New York? You have to come to LA, otherwise you're not going to be able to build a house. And then everyone told them, like, why are you so hands-off? Then everyone told them, why are you taking so much risk so early on? And just ignored all that advice. And, they followed their heart. They did what they genuinely believed in, which was finding great voices, finding great scripts, and then backing that talent. And so that's 100% what we want to do. So we're sort of like, there's conventional wisdom and it's great. But actually what we're here is to find great voices and stories and back. So we want to be A24 in that way. We like Hello Sunshine, which is Reese Witherspoon's company, because, again, she's very experimental in terms of the bet she takes in terms of stories. So when she made Big Little Lies, and also when she made Little Fires Everywhere, people were like, no one is going to want to watch stories about 40-year-old women, talking about motherhood and divorce. Obviously, they've been such huge hits. And actually, it's not just that she does book adaptations. Little Fires Everywhere is a book adaptation, but that book doesn't talk about race. But her series isn't just an exploration of class and motherhood. It is also an exploration of race. So she's taken a book and she's elevated it. So I think that's also so interesting because, usually people say, oh, like a movie or film can never be better than a book. But, she's shown you it can be. So I think that's another great example for us, which is that you absolutely can break the mold with the sort of characters you show on screen in terms of age, in terms of gender, in terms of sexuality, in terms of how pretty they are.
Right.
So that's another thing. And then I guess the third place I would say we'd love to be like is Pixar. Because if you've read Ed Catmull's book, it's his entire book talks about the culture at Pixar.
Creativity Inc., that's the one that you
Yes, Creativity Inc. And it's a beautiful book on how to build culture at a creative company, because I think that's so often ignored. You are so focused on first developing stories because, it is really difficult to come up with a great, unique concept, to write a script. It is really difficult to place the film. It is really difficult to actually shoot on time, on budget. That you're so focused on, the everyday stuff that it's very rare to take a step back and say, hey, what culture am I actually building overall, for the people that work here every day. And I think Pixar obviously has done a stunning job, even though now they've been acquired by Disney, which is sort of a behemoth company. They've managed to keep their culture, right? So that's what we want to...
Who hasn't been acquired by Disney?
Yeah.
Hey, hi, Disney.
Yeah. Maybe. Who knows? Maybe we'll be co-workers at Disney one day.
Tiger, come and get me.
But yeah, I think in terms of culture, we're very, very careful because we want to be a great place to work. I think that's super important, right? Like we want to find good people and then we want to keep them.
That's fantastic. I love the three references that kind of guide what you're trying to do. Obviously, it reflects all the important words you said about Boundless before. Experimental, new age, relevant. Let me pivot quickly and talk about Cancel. I think that's the most recent web series that you put out. One of my favorite young actors is in it, Chinmay Chandran.
I love Chinmay.
I love his presence on screen.
He's hilarious.
Yeah, he's super fun. I think way back in 2018, when I think his first web series or so was Immature. That he did. And I had the good fortune of working on Immature for a little bit. I also managed to get it sent to Kansiri, the first Kansiri that happened, where Immature got showcased. And my God, I mean, that guy is a riot in that show. And the couple of episodes that I saw for Cancel, again, my predilection for him aside, it's a very, very fresh look at things, right? It's one of those concepts that could easily get you into trouble, right? So for the uninitiated, and I'll let you do the introduction after I give my one-liner, is it's a show where two guys and a girl who are just out of their teens or early 20s decide to start something called an anti-cancel culture club to take on trolls and stuff on the internet, right? Very, very easy to get into trouble, very, very easy to rub people the wrong way. How did you bring this to life? What was the inspiration? Tell us more about cancel.
Sure, and actually that's a great description. Thank you for that and also for watching it. So cancel is exactly that, right? It's a tragicomedy. So, it's a combination of comedy, but also it's not a comedy. It's things we do go wrong, as you will see in the episodes to come, where we follow the story of 3 Gen Zers. We specifically calling it a Gen Z show because we think that especially this generation, this class of 2020, is in such an interesting phase of transition when it comes to coming of age. And that's actually how we came up with the show. We were just thinking, okay, we're complaining about the pandemic. We're complaining about working from home and the transition that this is causing for us. But imagine if you were 18, 19, 20 right now. Imagine if you were just going to college, coming of age, building relationships, and then suddenly you're forced to go back and live with your parents. Imagine if you're just looking for your first job, asking people to take a bet on you, and now, you're in a pandemic and no one is willing to meet you. Like, how would you feel? So we said, let's really look at, and also, of course, we are all living online, but this generation, the gen of, people who were born in 93 and below, they live online in a different way, right? To them, often, I think their online lives are much more real than their offline lives, which is obviously what's leading to a huge generation gap, leading to a lot of mental health issues, leading to body image issues, leading to confusion about sexuality and who they are. So we said, let's explore what this generation is going through in a very fun way, but to make it very relevant, let's also explore the explosion of online hate. Now, this was all the way back in May, June. So we had no idea what was coming, because obviously it takes time, right? It takes time to write, shoot, edit, put out a series. It's not, and we had crazy quick turnaround times, obviously, because it was lockdown. But still, it just I guess we were very lucky in the sense that we obviously saw this. We saw cancel culture, trolling, online hate building, but we obviously couldn't predict what was going to happen in our own country, between June and September, October. And actually, I guess, when you watch the show, you will see we ask really tough questions. We ask, what does it mean to be a bully? Why do people bully? Are sometimes the people who are all being bullied also bullies, and what impact are your online actions having on people's offline mental health? So again, with this, we've not taken a stance. We've not at all said that at any point these 3 Gen Z kids are right or they're wrong. Basically, the story is of how they come to try and fight online trolls. And then you will see through some twists and turns that even they're left confused about how do you actually save the world, because it's not that easy to be a hero, and sometimes the lines between right and wrong are blurred. So basically, this and all our other series, we want to make people think. They're not obviously they're entertaining, but we also want to start a conversation. We want you to watch it, and then we want you to think, okay, how have I behaved online? Have I done something that maybe hurt someone unintentionally or intentionally?
That's very interesting, because I saw a very, very relevant and very Indian treatment to this entire field.
Yeah.
Right? And one dialogue that really stood out to me was I think in the beginning of the second episode, when the girl is looking at her face, and she says, "Auntie ko bol dungi, roti to gol nahi banani aati, but mera chehra gol gol ho gaya hai."
Yeah.
Right? They just look how gender is perceived and how body issues are perceived, and just in such an offhand, relevant way places it in there. In that sequence, further, Chinmay's character talks to the girl and says, "Oh, aap South Indian ho, par aapki to awaaz mein accent nahi hai." And these are such innocuous little things. Pardon the pun. But they're so important, and they're very important in the Indian experience, right? Because these Gen Z characters, these Gen Z kids today, and when you say that their existence is so online, it also exposes them to discourse and thought that is so rooted in Western culture, right? Microaggressions or all of that. Right?
Yeah.
What does that mean in the Indian context? Exactly. I don't think there's enough entertainment, especially fiction entertainment in India, that treats it with the seriousness and the empathy and a little bit of humor. So I was quite excited to see Cancel come out. I want to ask you about Boundless a little more, but another quick question on Cancelled and Gen Z. What are some other nuances that you feel are important when you're making content or making entertainment for Gen Z as opposed to other cohorts?
So, we were just saying, I also think, by the way, again, call out to how beautifully you just said it. I sort of want to, I'll replay that to my team. That's exactly what we're trying to do, because even cancel culture, by the way, right? We call the show Cancelled. Most Indians don't know what cancel culture is. It's either called online bullying or trolling. So we're actively trying to do that. We're trying to say, okay, how can you take a Western concept and actually bring it and localize it to India? So that's actually what we say. We say we're telling stories that are locally rooted but can resonate globally.
Absolutely.
So to answer your question, so we think Gen Z is a super interesting demographic. And I think it's so funny that people still call them kids. So, I've been talking to a bunch of journalists as well about Cancelled, and every time I talk to them, they call them children. And I'm like, no, these are not children. Like, honestly, because I also work with a lot of Gen Zers, like this generation is so much more grown up and so much more intelligent emotionally, but also more sensitive emotionally, I think, than we were, right? Because so they have the internet at their fingertips. So, you can't fool them. Anything they want to know, they look up. So, they think deeply about sexuality. They think deeply about politics. They think deeply about climate change. When at least when I was 17, 18, I was just thinking, how do I bunk a class? Like, where am I going to hang out? Where am I going to hang out this afternoon? Or can I skip this tuition? I didn't have the weight of the world on my shoulders. But I think these kids do. And I also think, I totally didn't have the same pressure about how I look, because I didn't have all these filters, exactly like you said. I didn't have these filters. I wasn't questioning. Obviously I had Indian aunties who did tell me, sometimes you're too fat, you're too dark, whatever. But never to that extent where, my appearance was linked to how many likes or comments or engagement I got, right? Like, I wasn't thirst-trapping or sexting. Like you see with this generation. So I think they're just growing up so much more quickly that I honestly think them at 18 is where were at 25, 26, and honestly where our parents were at 35. So sometimes I see Indian uncles and then I see Gen Zers and I'm like, oh my God, like these Indian uncles shouldn't be talking down to these kids, because these kids in a way, they're more educated, they're more open-minded, they know more. So I think that's the generation that we want to cater to, it's the woke generation that wants to talk about these things.
And I'm glad that people are creating for them, not as children, but as people, right? As people who have a markedly different set of values, a markedly different source of what is right and wrong and what is their worldview. Right? It's fantastic. Let me ask you this then about Boundless, and just flip over from the creative side of what you're doing to the revenue side of things. You mentioned about how you started. Geo was exploding. OTT was really coming up in India. The way the landscape is right now, the production houses that are trying to move into these spaces and create for these cohorts, for other cohorts as well. Gone are the days when it used to be only AIB and TVF, or AIB, TVF and Filter Copy. Now it's there's Boundless and there's All Right and there's Bhadipa and there's everybody else, right? In that space, how do you situate Boundless from a revenue perspective? Are you looking at from a more branded content play, or are you looking at a purer, weird thing to say, purer content orientation where you're going to create either for platforms or for your audience directly? What's the play there?
Yeah. So, we're definitely focused on platforms, but I also want us to keep an open mind, because our revenue model right now is definitely focused on platforms. We want to say we're telling high quality stories. They take time to develop. We invest in them. We understand this audience, your exact demographic, and we tell really deep stories. Characters are really well thought out. They're layered. We create a whole new world. Story can extend for seasons. Focus is on platforms. But, exactly like you just hinted at in your own question, right? Like there's this question about audience. And I think, again, it's like we're saying the whole ecosystem is changing. So, of course, you have all these platforms, both local and foreign, coming in. But I also I hope audiences are going to start looking for quality. So, we're obviously, it's still our first year, so we're obviously going to experiment. with revenue models. I think no one has found like a pure play model that works, if you ask me, to be honest. Like, I think every company, does a mix of going to platforms, branded content, going to theaters, going to festivals, making short films, licensing. Like, I mean, it's a mix, it's a mess, right? Because everyone, the whole entertainment industry is asking, how do you build a sustainable business model? So I don't want to pretend that like, oh, this is the one thing. So of course we'll experiment. But I think what will stay constant is the fact that we're telling high quality stories, and that's what we will link to the business model. It won't suddenly be that, we're going to dilute the quality of what we do.
That's fantastic. I think that as a high water mark for yourself becomes the best sort of guiding principle to go forward, right? And then you can monetize depending on where the funding is at. Let me ask you this: moving away from Boundless and a little bit more into the wisdom you have collected over the years, and let me pick it back a little bit. I'm going to ask you a very, very simple, straightforward question. I know a little bit of the answer because I'm an MBA myself, and I'd like to think I'm like a creative suit. I am neither of those words I like very much, but sometimes when you put them together, it somehow tends to make sense. What is the value of an MBA in the entertainment arts or in the entertainment arts business?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's honestly a great question, because I think, when I was, when I first applied to jobs in the entertainment industry while I was still doing my MBA, I was asking myself also that question. Like, what is the value of an MBA? How am I going to convince people to hire me into the entertainment industry? And I think even now, sometimes, people laughingly definitely ask me, like, why did you do an MBA? Why didn't you go to film school? Right? Because that would have been the more obvious thing to do. But I actually think that MBA has huge value. Like, I mean, like, exactly like I said, like, I couldn't have predicted, right? Like, why immunology and investing was helpful. But it really is. It's the same thing. Like, I couldn't have predicted how helpful the MBA is. But I think it's just it gives you a totally different framework for thinking about building a business. I think, and that's a big advantage, especially if most people that you're working with come from a creative field. Very few people in the industry actually think, how do you build a cohesive team? How do you build a great culture? How do you manage people? How do you, get different types of people to work together? How do you look for new talent? How do you get creative about marketing? How can you get creative about business models? I mean, that's the thing with the entertainment industry, that it's an industry. Like, it's not enough to just make a few good shows. It has to be sustainable. So it's a tough business. I mean, honestly, it's a lot easier. Like, if you're making a product that is commoditized, right? I mean, it's totally different from making like toothpaste and selling it, because once you find product market fit with the toothpaste, you scale it. But here, I mean, our product, every single day we're reinventing from scratch, because once you have that hit, obviously you have to come up with the next one. You can't just rely on that. Right? Like, how far is that going to take you? So I think having a business background actually really helps in an unstructured industry. Plus, actually, I think at least Stanford is a very creative school. So Stanford hugely focuses on design thinking, on communication and emotional intelligence. Right. So I think that's actually what's really paying off. Is because, I mean, again, as a producer, right, like, what are you doing? You're basically finding talent, you're working with them, you're managing them, you're getting stuff done. So that combination of communication and emotional intelligence is, like, I think the basic thing. Like, I mean, you first need that, and then you need to be true. So I think that's been helpful. But I mean, obviously, you should ask me in like 5, 10, 20 years, because my husband says, the MBA pays off in 20 years, not right now.
Absolutely. The way I've simplified it to myself is that the word show business is 2 parts, show and business. You can probably make a show, but to make a business, you need to have business skills. And that's what an MBA helps you think through, right? Is it a must-have? Sure, it's not a must-have. But whoever I speak to, right? And I'm very fortunate to have had deep conversations about the value of an MBA in show business with people who've been here 20 years, right? Whether it's Ganesh Iyer at Radio Mirchi, who's a 96 or 95 IMA pass out, who flipped over into this business, or Tarun Tripathi, for that matter, the guy who was on the first episode of the show, who's again a 2001, 2002 to IIM Lucknow pass out, who pitched his own job to Yash Raj, right? And or people like you and me, who have spent the last 10 years or so figuring this out, right? I think there are certain skills that definitely helped me keep pace with how fast the industry is moving. I think the other thing that having an MBA really does is it opens up your worldview to learnings from hundreds of other businesses and business sectors, right? Storytellers or entertainers tend to be very inward looking in that sense, right? You're so focused on unearthing human insights, or you're so focused on getting that different spin on the cliche story that you tend to forget what's happening around the world and get lessons from out of it, right? I think what stood out to me from your toothpaste example as well was other businesses might be commodities selling, whereas entertainment specifically remains prototype selling. Every day you're selling a new product. It's a new prototype. There is never going to be tripling again. You can do season 2, but that's an entirely different product, right? It's not Colgate and then Colgate Active Fresh. उसमें कुछ खास फर्क नहीं. एक आध formulation में फर्क है, but everything else is the same. So very, very early days, still in India, although it's been happening for 25, 30 years, that MBAs are moving into entertainment, but still little more understanding there. And I'm sure people like you, people like me, and 5 and 10 more years in this space will kind of help us formalize that a little bit more. Let me pivot this to what is sort of my last question to you. And it's something that I've looked up to you for a while as well, right? You're one of the earliest podcasters that I knew of who was doing so much cool stuff, right? Your poetry became part of your podcast. I've gone through your Instagram, and the kind of response that your poetry gets, and the kind of response that your podcast is able to bring it all together. I want to know how you decide to program all of this, right? I mean, poetry is such a vast open space, right? You could write Milk and Honey, or you could write Leaves of Grass, or you could write Gitanjali, or whatever it is. There's so much to do. How do you program your poetry, and then how do you take that into your podcast? What's the thought process here, and what keeps you going? Where does the motivation to write poetry come from? I'll tell you why I'm asking you this. Is many years ago I used to have a band, and I used to write lyrics and songs and poetry. And a few years after we stopped playing as an active band, I still would write poetry and publish it. And my guitarist was like, "Bro, kya poetry? Why?" And I stopped, right? And for some reason I stopped. I was like, maybe not. But it's very fascinating to see people. I mean, I still write poetry for myself, or I share it with my wife. But it's very fascinating to see someone like you continue to put out poetry and then build an entire podcast around it. What motivates you? Where does the programming insight come from? How do you keep creating like that?
I mean, that's a great question that I think I honestly myself have not answered, and it's also one of my fears, right? So I'll answer both parts. One is, how do I program? And then 2, how do I keep creating? So I guess, honestly, the first part of how do I program, the answer is I don't. So I think, when it comes to my production house in Boundless, I'm very structured. I'm like, okay, this is the plan. These are the concepts that we're working on. This is our pipeline. This is our audience, etc., etc. But when it comes to poetry, I'm the opposite. I don't force myself to write, and I don't think, okay, like these are the 5 topics I'm going to write about this week, and then this is what's going to be next week. Because I mean, like I said, with Boundless, I think the reason that it worked is it was genuinely my personal diary. It was, I wrote what I was feeling, I just shared it, and it did well. And I think with poetry, I don't think you can package it. I think there has to be this rawness and honesty, which is why, honestly, I'm not building a business around it. So, it's like you said, right? It's a show business. You have to build a business. With poetry, I don't know. Like, I'm just like, this is what I do on the side. I genuinely enjoy it. It keeps me sane. It allows me to express myself. Other people like it. So it's genuinely what I do for fun. And I don't want to put structure around it, because I think that would kill it. And
what I read of your poetry, it also reflects certain anxieties of your life in India as a woman, as a creator. I think it does compute that it's an outlet for you, and it makes sense that you don't control it, that you let it kind of come through. Right? That's very interesting.
Yeah, and I think the second part is, that's what I was saying. That's my fear, right? Because you're like, how do you keep making it? And I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe in 1 or 2 years I'll wake up and then I won't have anything to say. I think that's fine. I think you can't put. What I don't want to do, at least personally, is put pressure on myself. to say that, I have to make or create a certain amount of poetry. Like, I want to do it while it's genuine and honest. And I mean, that's the beautiful thing about storytelling, right? Like this poetry, it can be made into a podcast. It could also be made into a song, exactly like you said, right? So, I mean, there's a lot we can already do with it now. We can make it into mixed media video. We can make it into animated video. We can make it into a song. So there's a lot we can do with the existing stuff, which maybe we'll find a way to do. But I don't want to be like, this is the plan for the next 5 years. I think that's why I have so much sympathy for writers. Because the second you start saying that you have to build a franchise, I think that's where writer's block comes from. Right. I think writers don't have writer's block until you tell them this is what you have to do.
Yeah, when it's a burden of creation, the stakes go up before you even put a word down on paper.
Exactly. So this is just my way to talk to people. Like, the poetry is, I'm just having a conversation, and I also I love it when people write back, and I think that's actually been really cool. It's not that just I'm writing. Actually, a lot of people write back, but it's interesting. They don't write in the comments; they DM me. So, even you said, right? Like, I thought that was interesting. You say you write poems, but you only share them, with your wife. And I think that's sort of what I want to encourage, is that why can't we share it? That's the whole point, I think, of sort of, having the internet, that you can put anything out there. And I mean, it's fine. Some stuff will be good. Some stuff won't, but it's sort of a process. So I actually want to encourage more people just to sort of share freely and just see where it goes.
No, my fear is the complete opposite. My fear is that if they like it and then they start expecting me to write more, then I don't do. That's it. I'm joking. That brings me to, I mean, it's interesting you talked about how you can take a certain type of expression, whether it's a poem, and then turn it into so many different things. You've got a new book coming up.
Yes, touch wood. I'm very excited about that. So my second poetry book is being published by Bloomsbury. And it's called Reinvention. So, Boundless was basically, like I'm saying, about finding my voice. And now Reinvention is about making it heard. Right. Because I wrote Boundless just when I moved back to India after 10 years, right? So it was my journey of self-discovery. Reinvention is written, 2 years after I've been in the country. So obviously I've gone through that process of having to learn to balance family and work and, what it means to be a daughter-in-law and wife. And there are more gender roles, obviously, in India, and I think family does play a different role, here versus, I think, maybe in the US or UK. And so I think there's just a different type of pressure and expectation in terms of how many balls you're juggling and what you're doing. Right. So Reinvention is basically this asking the questions of, how do you maintain your voice? How can you build community, but also maintain your independence? Because, there's this, if you've seen Little Women, the Greta Gerwig version of Little Women, there's this really, really interesting scene where Jo, who's a protagonist, who's a writer, she's obviously talented, she's super independent, she knows she's going to be successful, she's at the cusp of success, she's extremely unhappy, and she says, why do I have to be so lonely, right? Because she's basically saying that to choose success and independence, she also has to choose loneliness, and that's tough. And so basically that's sort of the, one of the questions that I'm looking at through the book, that, can you really maintain your relationships while also, building a career? So, and it's called Reinvention because, I obviously have had to reinvent, I think, myself. That's the other message that, we're all reinventing ourselves. We better adapt to change. And again, obviously this was written, part of, some of it was written pre-pandemic. But I think the message is just going to be stronger, now that we've all lived to 2020.
Sounds like a very pertinent message there, and sounds like a very, very interesting take on things, right? Because when you see, and we live in privileged, sort of rarefied echelons of society, right? Where some of us more than the others, but even then, these considerations, these factors, these social conditioning still plays a role in how we evolve and how we grow. So I'm looking forward to that coming out, and I'm sure, as are thousands of other people. My last question, and honestly, last question, something that I ask everyone before I let them go from this show, is a recommendation from you to our listeners. It could be a book, a movie, a music album, music video, a game, a meme, anything. an entertainment recommendation from Natasha Malpani-Oswal to my listeners.
Oh, wow, interesting. This is a surprise question. I actually have an answer. I'm just looking up the name of got it. Okay, so I obviously watch a lot of films and shows because, that's part of my job. And like I was saying, I'm obsessed with reading, so I consume a lot of content. Right. But there's this film that's really stayed with me and has been haunting me for the last few months. It's by Charlie Kaufman, who is the writer-director of Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind and Anomalisa. It's a film called I'm Thinking of Ending Things. So it's on Netflix. And it is such a stunningly made film because he basically looks at the meaning of life and of hope. So he basically questions, why do we have hope as humans? And also, is hope good for us or bad for us? Because I don't want to give away too much. You absolutely have to watch the film because there's a huge mislead in it. It follows the story of this girl who goes to her boyfriend's house in the middle of nowhere in a snowstorm where things start taking a darker turn and start getting really scary and eerie, and she can't understand like what's happening and why things are going wrong. And then there's a big twist in the tale, which I won't tell you. But through the story, you basically sort of explore what does memory mean? How do we define success? Why do we tell ourselves stuff like every cloud has a silver lining? Or like, the things will only get better when sometimes that's not true. We basically like fill ourselves with like these sayings of how success is right around the corner. But genuinely, honestly, very few people, really get to live exactly the life they want, right? But it's hope that keeps us going. So it's a very depressing take on hope, but also just like a masterclass in filmmaking in the way he sort of builds up the tension and the eeriness and sort of leads you to the twist that I think basically makes you need to watch the whole movie again to make meaning of it. So, sorry, not a fun recommendation. I don't even know if it like falls under the entertainment category, but just like a really smart film that makes you think.
Oh no, absolutely. It absolutely falls under the entertainment. I'm so glad you didn't say Fleabag. I've just banned people from saying Fleabag. So for a second, I was like, hey, she's going to say Fleabag, but she didn't.
Or Parasite, right? Fleabag or Parasite. Yeah, like two standard answers.
You can't say Parasite either, right? Fleabag. But yeah, I'm thinking of Ending Things by Charlie Kaufman on Netflix. That's the recommendation from Natasha Malpani-Oswal. Natasha, it has been a pleasure speaking to you. I'm so glad we finally did this. It's a very interesting new space that you're looking to explore with Boundless, and I wish you all the best with all your upcoming releases. I hope Cancel does really, really well, and so do the others that are coming out. I hope you had fun on this episode of Storytellers and Storysellers.
I had a great time. Thank you so much for having me, and let's definitely stay in touch. And obviously, I'm going to keep listening to your seasons because honestly, like I learn a lot from your episodes. So keep doing this.
Great validation, and that's my motivation for doing it. So thank you for that. That's it from Calabar on Storytellers and Storysellers. This is me, Vineet, saying goodbye.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I wanted to kind of just give a quick reminder to everybody. As I mentioned up top, we are doing our annual listener survey right now. If you could please go and take a couple of minutes out of your day and fill it out, we would really, really appreciate it. It's ivmpodcast.com/survey. If you're comfortable giving us your email address, we'll enter you into a random drawing, and we're going to be sending out swag to a bunch of randomly selected listeners. So do definitely get on board that train. Let me tell you a little bit about what we did on the network this week. We launched a new show called Zindagi Diaries with Ragini Kumar. Many of you might have seen Ragini on television during the IPL. She's a presenter, but she's showing a different side of herself over here with a poetry podcast. Give it a shot, give it a listen. Let me know what you all think. Vishal Gondal is back this week after a while. He's been on an extended break, but he has Rahul Narvekar for the first episode. Really interesting conversation. Do check it out. Raji Samant joins Gauri Devidayal on This Round Is On Me to talk about the wine business and what's going on there. We had a number of conversations about the Farmers' Bill and the surrounding agitation this week on the network as well. Maruk Inayat had a great episode on the note. Puliabazi did a deep dive into the issues around this. And on Siders, we have our typical, fun conversation about this stuff with a little bit of a seriousness, a little bit of fun. Do check that out on Cock and Bull on Thursday last week. Akash Mehta joined us for that episode. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Sachin Tendulkar, Virat Kohli, Don Bradman. And now, Cyrus Brocha. Okay, probably not in the right company. I mean, Don Bradman is Australian. But it's called Cyrus Says, a wonderful show about everything. Find the show on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to podcasts.